All right, so today in the costume shop, we are going to be talking about patterns. Patterns are kind of the foundation of what we do here, what we use. We use all sorts of different types of patterns. Sometimes we're going to be self-drafting patterns. If one of the designers comes up with a sketch that literally has never existed before, our very talented costume shop staff is going to be able to drape or to draft that pattern. But we're not going to talk about that today. That's for another week. Today we're going to talk about pre-printed patterns. So when you go online or you go to the fabric store, there's a large selection of patterns. You go into little books and you flip through the little books and you pick out what you want and you can buy a pattern. And that pattern is going to give you all the information that you need to create the garment that's on the front of that pattern. There are lots of other ways to get patterns though. So we're going to go through some more esoteric ways, and then we're going to go through legit how to read a big commercial pattern, all the tips and tricks that you need to know, all the kind of pitfalls that get in our way. So we're going to go through all that. So the first kind of really esoteric thing that we can do to find our patterns is we can go to books. We're a university, so we have a library, and we have a very extensive library here in the costume shop too. So we're going to go to our books. There are a plethora of antique and vintage reproduction pattern books that date all the way back to the 16th century that we have access to, that we can use to find our shapes to create our garments. One of those books that we use here, one of these books we use here is, this is just an example of a period tailoring book. So back in oldie-timey days, people weren't going to go out and they couldn't purchase pre-printed patterns until about the beginning of the 20th century. There are some earlier ones, but it starts becoming a really commercially viable sort of thing about the beginning of the 20th century. So prior to that, people would purchase home magazines, ladies magazines, tailoring books, all these different places where the patterns would be printed in small scale form. And the person who was making the garment would have to take their own measurements. So there's an example here of exactly the measurements that they want you to take. And then here's a list of all of the different type of measurements that they want you to take. So measurement A to B is your natural waist length, A to C is the full length of bodice, and so on and so forth. So our Edwardian lady would take all of these measurements, and then she would flip through this book and she would find exactly what she wanted to make. So we're going to just flip to this example here of our bodice. And what she would do, and this is actually a really lovely system because it preserves the proportions and it extrapolates them out directly for the person whose measurements you're working from. So we have all of these crazy letters and numbers here. And she would take all of these letters and numbers here and she would lay out a big piece of paper, use her ruler, and then follow all of these instructions to draft this bodice pattern that is going to fit her exactly. And by doing all of the math here, A to B plus a ½ inch, A to C 1/2 scale, by doing all of this math here, she's going to come out with this shape and this pattern that should fit her exactly. So it looks complicated, but it's actually really, really simple if you follow the instructions exactly. It's like making a pattern from a recipe. If you can follow a recipe, you can draft a pattern using this system and using this method. And there are modern examples of books like this as well. There are pattern books that tell you how to draft basic bodice blocks, how to draft things like pants and skirts and that sort of thing. But we do see this quite a bit in these period examples. And this was the way that folks would get all of these crazy patterns before we had printed patterns. And they'd share them and they'd pass them around and they'd stay up to date with the latest fashions by self-drafting and by doing all of this really, really kind of crazy sort of math. But it's a really elegant technique. And once you get the hang of it, it's really not that complicated. It just takes a little time and maybe the calculator on your phone. So that is an example of a period pattern book, a period tailoring book. Again, there are some of these that go all the way back to the 16th century. And even if you don't use these books to kind of draft your patterns, to scale out your patterns using that kind of crazy complicated mathematical system, it's a really great way to learn what the shapes look like. And this is really, really important as we're starting to do theatrical costuming and as we're starting to do kind of a reproduction clothing, is figuring out what the 2D shape looks like and how that translates into 3D. And so these don't really have a lot of pictures of what you're going to end up with. It just has a picture of the pattern and it has the instructions. The Edwardian woman who would be working from one of these books would be experienced enough to know how the 2D translates into the 3D because she's really used to doing this. But this is a really good way for us in the 21st century to kind of figure out what all of these pattern shapes look like as we're flipping through our research and as we're working through our older catalogs, our Sears catalogs, our JCPenney catalogs, to really figure out what these garments look like in the 2D form so that we can recreate them. A more modern example of that, this is one of my super, super favorite books. My background is in medieval and Renaissance costuming way, way, way back in the day. And so the Tudor Tailor is a really lovely example of a modern version of that Edwardian pattern book that we just looked at. And so this has some really, really lovely information in the beginning about period clothing, about the images that they're drawing, their information from, color palettes, and that sort of thing. But what's really valuable about this book is that it has really detailed instructions and it has gridded patterns, just like we saw on the Edwardian ladies tailoring book. And so here, they've given us instructions on how to use this book and how to use these patterns. So any of these books that have smaller gridded patterns are going to give you instructions and they're going to give you the scale. They're going to show you exactly how to draft these patterns. The one thing that's a little different about using something like this versus the Edwardian ladies tailoring book that we looked at previously is that these are only one size. So here it tells us that these patterns for women are sized at a 36-inch bust, 28-inch waist, and a 38-inch hip. And for our men, we've got a 38-inch chest, 34-inch waist, and about a height of 5'7" to 5'10". So these patterns are made specifically for these measurements and these measurements only. So when you're using these gridded patterns, what generally is going to work best is to draft the pattern to the measurements and then scale it up or down as needed to fit. But this is going to get you a really, really solid shape, and it's going to help you understand the proportions, again, of what we're looking to recreate. And so an example here, they have these really, really lovely line drawings of some women's gowns from the early 16th century. So we see the images and we see exactly what we want to recreate here. And then they have all sorts of instructions on how to fit them, how to put them together. And then we have our gridded pattern scale. And so what this is, if you can see, we've got a little kind of a graph paper grid here. The directions tell us that each of those little squares is 1 inch by 1 inch. So what you would do is you would take these pattern pieces and either draw out or get gridded pattern paper and use follow the pattern, just fill in the lines. And so you're going to count how many little squares are going across here, how many little squares are going down here, and recreate these little scale drawings up into an actual pattern piece that you can then adjust to fit yourself or your actor. So these books are really, really great tools. There are a plethora of these out there now. This is one of my favorites because 16th century costume is kind of my jam, but there are lots of different pattern books, lots of different eras. And so this one is based off of the author's research, not really working from too many extant garments, but they were able to work from a few. If we look at another book, this particular series, Patterns of Fashion, was written by a clothing historian named Janet Arnold, and she was wonderful, wonderful historian. And she had the opportunity, let's see.
Sarah McGinn says, I love her.
I know, right? She's like legit the best. And they're actually reprinting these. The School of Historical Dress in England got the rights from drama book specialists, and so they're in the process of getting the earlier editions of Patterns of Fashion reprinted. So right now, this particular book is totally out of print. It's like stupid expensive if you purchase it used, but hold off. I think they said about a year and a half-ish, you know, depending on what happens with COVID, whatever. But, you know, hold off, and you should be able to get a copy of these earlier ones through the School of Historic Dress. So yeah, super excited. So, but Ms. Arnold was able to study in detail just a plethora of period garments. And so what she did in this particular book series is that she drew out these really, really lovely sketches that show you exactly what you're working from, what you're looking to recreate. She's giving you all the information that you need. So a lot of these you can actually look up online now, and you can see full color pictures of these. I think the original, this one was written back in the 70s. So you didn't have that information now, but we live in the 21st century, which is fantastic. And then she again has gridded out all of the pattern pieces so we know exactly what these shapes looked like. Now these pattern pieces are sketched out and they're gridded out to the original size of the garment. So, you know, you'll have to size up or size down depending on what you need personally and what your actor may need, but it's giving you these shapes. And those shapes are what's really, really important to us, especially when we're dealing with, you know, shapes that may be unusual to us, shapes we haven't experienced before. There's some really, really lovely pieces like this. And then if we start to get into, let's see if I can flip. Once we start getting into like the 1820s, 1830s, we start getting into some really kind of wacky stuff with these big poofy sleeves, these big leg of mutton sort of style sleeves. And it can be hard to interpret what that means, what that shape would look like without really having access to the garment. And so these gridded pattern pieces are going to give us those shapes, and they're going to give us the proportions that we need to scale them up and down. So this is a really fantastic book, a really fantastic series. So working from gridded patterns is one way to do it. It's a good way to get a lot of information in a very, very small, compact package. Then we also have access to larger books. This book doesn't even fit on my doc scan. This is a book about Madeleine Vianney's garments. And some of these are legit just giving us images of the garment and then the shapes without any dimensions. And so this is going to be a really advanced technique. A pattern maker or technician is going to be able to look at these sketches and interpret how all of these shapes work together to create, oops, there we go, to create this really, really beautiful garment. But there are no dimensions, there's no scale, there's really not a lot of information to work from other than the shapes. So again, this is a really advanced technique, but somebody with a lot of experience can take these shapes and use these to replicate a pattern that is going to work for themselves or for their actor. So never underestimate the power of the book. Our books are going to be our BFFs. when we're doing historic costuming, especially if we're dealing with something that's a little weirder, a little more esoteric. It's going to give us a lot of information. So use your books. All right, so the next thing that we have access to is actual historic patterns. So printed patterns showed up about the turn of the century, give or take a few years, and they are widely available through the 20th century. So we have access to a lot of period patterns. But the trick is to learn how to read them, because they're going to be very, very different than a modern pattern. And so we're going to look at some of the oldest patterns that we have here in our collection. This particular pattern is from late 19-teens, early 1920s, somewhere in that general vicinity. I actually tried to date this last night and could not find an exact date for this. I couldn't find this pattern anywhere online. This particular brand I could find a lot of examples of, but this one I couldn't find at all. So who knows, this may be the only one that's left, which is super exciting. But this is going to give us a lot of really, really important information. Also, I just want to note, we didn't do this tapey thingy, but I can't take it off now because it would damage it even further. So this isn't my fault. I'm really sorry. I know that a lot of historians out there are cringing at this Scotch tape that's going around here. Not our fault. All right, so we've got this really gorgeous, this lovely image of the actual garment that we're making. And then what we also have is information about the material required here. I'm going to go into that in a little more detail in one of the later ones, because this is really faint. It's really hard to read. But basically, this little paragraph right here, these are all the instructions that you're going to, and Adrienne is nodding vigorously because I have thrown many of these patterns at her face and said, please make this for me. But this is all the instructions that we get, because at the time when these patterns were printed, there was the assumption that the people who were making these garments had the knowledge and had the techniques, so that they really didn't need a lot of information. So we just kind of have the bare minimum information over here to put these garments together. This particular one actually comes with a larger instruction sheet, which is pretty unusual for a lot of these patterns. But it's a lovely, lovely piece here. And it's going to give you, again, very, very simple instructions. We've got our cutting instructions here that tell us how we're going to cut this piece out. And then we have our layout examples that's showing us how to lay the pattern out onto the fabric, depending on the width of the material. So you can see here, we've got 36-inch material, and they're showing us how to lay that pattern out on 36. And then we've got 40-inch and 54-inch material. So back in the oldie-timey days, fabrics came in a variety of widths. And it was much more common to have very, very, compared to modern, very, very narrow widths of fabric. So this 36-inch fabric width is not common modernly, but it is common for period pieces. And so as a modern costumer or modern sewer, you're going to have to do some math. Or you just buy extra. I usually just buy extra. But you're going to have to do some math and figure out if this pattern is drafted for 36-inch material and it's telling me that I need X number of yards for 36 inches, but your material is 45 inches or 54 inches or 60 inches, your job is to figure out how that pattern gets laid out and how much material you actually need to purchase. So these patterns can be a little tricksy to use, especially the ones that don't come with a lot of instructions, but they are really marvelous, marvelous little pieces of history. Kind of the other really kind of interesting thing about period pattern pieces, and this one doesn't even look like it has been used, which is super exciting, is that they are not printed and they are pre-cut. So when we look at more modern pattern pieces, we're going to see lots of printed lines that we need to figure out and we need to decipher, and we're going to figure out what size to cut out. With older patterns, you purchase the size that you need, and so it only came with the one size, and then rather than having your letters labeling what each pattern piece is, it actually has this perforated little cutout here. So this is pattern piece C. We've got that here. And then they use these perforations to show us what we need to do with this pattern. So if you're using antique patterns, or if you're using reproduction antique patterns, a lot of times you'll need to go to the directions, or if the directions don't exist anymore, go online. Most of these were pretty common, and figure out, what do these 3 dots in the middle of this pattern piece mean? What do these 2 dots here at the end of the pattern piece mean? Typically when you have a series of dots in a row like this is going to be your grain line, and we'll go into what that means. And then when you have little dots on the edge here, that could either indicate this is where a join happens, where you're going to sew 2 pattern pieces together, or this could actually also indicate what your seam allowance is. So that's why looking at the pattern pieces, looking at the instructions, going online and figuring out what the dots mean for the particular company that manufactured this pattern can be really, really important. But these historic patterns are just remarkable pieces of history, and they can be really, really useful for the period costumer, or for a theatrical costumer. Again, most of them are single-sized, so they have to be resized to fit your actor, fit yourself. But once you have the shapes there, it can be very, very easy to do that resizing. So here we've got another example. This is a late 1920s suit. Here it's going to give us information about how to lay the pattern out on, this is particularly 54-inch fabric. It's going to give us our sizes, so what size you need to purchase for specific measurements. And then here we can see, this is telling us exactly what all of those little perforations on these particular patterns mean. So you've got little arrows here for joining of seams. We've got 2 little cutouts for straight of goods, 3 little cutouts for placing on the fold, and 1 for other directions. And so this is a more common example. And again, we did not do this Scotch tape thing. Please don't add us about this. Makes me sad too. So this is the whole envelope here. So this is an old Simplicity pattern. This is a pattern company that is still in existence. And these are all the instructions that we're getting. So we get a little bit of information here about how to put together some of the less common things here. And then we've got this little paragraph here and this teeny tiny print, and that's all you get. So you take that, you take your, I'm not even going to unfold these because this has never been unfolded, but you take your pattern pieces and you get that. So working with antique patterns and vintage patterns can be really challenging, but it is so rewarding, and it's really, really exciting. And it is accessible as well. And we're going to show you exactly how that accessibility fits into your life here momentarily. And so I'm just going to go through a few examples of some of the antique patterns that we have here. This is another Simplicity from the early 1930s. That is really exciting. Some really lovely shapes there. Take that one out because this has really lovely cover art on it. This is a 1930s, this is a Butterick. This is another pattern company that still exists. You can see this is still single sized. So size 12 back in the 1930s was a 30-inch bust. So the other thing we need to be really careful about with these antique patterns is that the sizing is drastically different than modern sizing. I don't know what a modern size 12 bust is, but it sure as heck is not 30 inches. But as we start to get into the 1930s, We still have our perforated pattern pieces. So you can see we've got our little perforations right there. But we're starting to get into the era that's going to give us a little more information here. This is starting to look more like a modern pattern sheet. So this is actually very remarkably similar to a modern pattern sheet. It's giving us the line drawing, so we know exactly what we're making. It's giving us the shapes, so we know exactly what pattern pieces look like what. It's giving us our fabric layouts for different widths of fabric. And then it's also, this thing is so fragile, y'all. It's also giving us much more detailed instructions now. And so we start to see these really detailed instructions pop up starting in about the 1930s and moving on. So we can actually learn a lot about historic construction techniques by reading these older patterns and seeing how they put things together. Some of the sewing techniques are going to be very, very different than what we use now. And that can be a really valuable tool to have in your toolbox if you're doing any sort of historic recreation. All right, we're going to put that aside. Oh, this one is one of my favorites too. So this came in a donation a few years ago, and this is a 1950s pattern. It is an Italian pattern. And it is just a lovely, lovely drawing here. It's in Italian. I have no idea what it says. And that is legit all you get. You get the drawing and you get this little stack of pattern pieces. It still has a pin in it, so obviously somebody put it together at some point. It has somebody's notes on them in Italian, but there are no instructions that come with this one. So this one, we haven't put this one together yet, but it's on my bucket list. I really want to see how this piece comes together. And I'm just going to flip through some period patterns here real quick. As we start to get into the 1950s, we're seeing patterns that look remarkably like what you would go to the store today to purchase. And we're seeing a lot of the brands that we still use here today, that little scalloped edges, adorbs. And we also start to see Vogue publish patterns starting in the late 1940s and then through the present day. They're producing these designer collections, which are just a kind of a cut above what you can get from some of the other pattern companies. These are much more elegant. They're very refined. They tend to be a little more complicated, but they're really, really lovely. And then what Vogue also did, and what a lot of pattern companies do nowadays still, is that they can hire out designers to create patterns for them. So this particular piece is a Schiaparelli pattern that was created in 1949. So this was the very, very first design that she did for Vogue. And she did them for about 10 or 15 years after 1949. But this was a really wonderful way for kind of home people, not home people, that sounds terrible, middle class people to get access to designer clothing without paying designer premiums. So you could go to your fabric store and you could purchase this designer pattern and make it at home yourself, and still have these really, really wonderful lines. I mean, look at this. This is 1949, and she has a single sleeved blouse that goes under the suit jacket. It's really, really incredible. So that is also on my bucket list of things to make. So if you don't have access to actual antique patterns, you can purchase them online. The price varies, but you can get them pretty easily on eBay, on Etsy, on lots of reseller sites. There are also companies, oh, that's terrible, glare on that is bad. There are companies that actually have reproduced a lot of these antique and vintage patterns. So Typically, they're not going to resize them. They're not going to regrade them for various sizes. Some of them do on their more popular patterns, but most of the time they're legit just reprinting the patterns that they have in their collection. These are things that have copyright has expired on them so that they can do that. And they are just reprinting these pattern pieces for us to use. Some of them come with a little more instructions. Some of them just come with a reproduction of the vintage instructions. But there are a variety of companies that are doing these actual reprints of historic patterns. And these can be really, really great tools to have in your theatrical toolbox, because antique patterns, especially kind of the older that they get, can be really, really expensive. So having these companies reprint these are such a useful tool. These are all patterns that we have used over the years here at University Theater. So that is an option as well. Again, typically they're going to come with the period instructions. You're not going to get a lot of information, but you'll get the shapes to work from. And then other companies, mostly our Simplicities, our Buttericks, our Vogues, kind of the big pattern companies that you get in the big stores, have reprinted and reissued a lot of the vintage patterns from their catalogs. The trick with these is that when they reprinted these, they actually that's not a reprint. What am I looking at? That's a reprint. There we go. When they reprinted these, they sized them and they graded them to modern measurements. And so folks have gone through and have the original pattern and compare it to the reprints. They're indicating that there are slight differences in the shapes. There are slight differences in how the pieces are put together. They've rewritten a lot of the instructions. So they can be a little challenging to use, and sometimes you don't get the exact shape if they're giving you kind of the original artwork. Sometimes it just doesn't look quite right. So these, we use these all the time. I love these, but we do need to kind of be careful about them, and we just need to be aware that if we want this may not look exactly like this. This may not give us exactly that picture. So we need to examine it really, really closely and be able to tweak the pattern so that we get exactly what we want. But what's nice about using these reproduction patterns is that they are completely modernized. They have modern instructions, so they're going to walk you through everything using kind of modern methods, and they are generally multi-sized. So we can purchase these for a wide variety of sizes and use these over and over and not have to regrade them ourselves. So these can be really, really useful tools as well. All right. And then the last thing is there are lots and lots of independent companies who have created pre-printed patterns that have sizing available, that have a multi-size on them as well. This is one of my personal favorites. I've used this jacket a lot. It's a great little jacket. The trick when you're using these independent pattern companies is that you just need to be really, really careful and really cognizant about the sizing on them, because companies, Truly Victorian is very body positive, which I love about them. So they don't give like a number size. They're not sizing this, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, whatever. They're not giving us those numbers. They're giving us letters that they have ascribed to these body measurements. And that takes away a lot of the stigma that comes, or the uncomfortableness that may come with the idea that you think that you're a certain size or somebody thinks they're a certain size, and it doesn't match up to the measurements because every pattern company is different. So by throwing away the numbers and using this letter system, this is a really, really body positive sort of movement, which a lot of independent pattern companies are moving towards, which I personally really, really love. So you just need to be careful and make sure that you're getting the size that works for you. And then the other thing that you need to be kind of careful about is that you're getting the right amount of fabric, you're getting the notions that you need, and that sort of thing. So these are really, really great tools to have in our toolbox. All right, so we went through sizing standards. Oh, the other thing that we need to be kind of cognizant about is if we're using period patterns, in order to make them look right, and actually let's look at one of the 1950s ones. That's going to give us a better example. In order to make this look right on a modern person, we need to have the undergarments that go underneath these dresses, these gowns as well, because the shape of undergarments have changed over the years with the fashion. If you look at undergarments from today versus the 1990s versus the 1980s to the 1950s, and then going back in time, undergarment shapes have changed, and that changes the silhouette of the body. So when you put a vintage pattern garment on top of modern undergarments, it can look odd, it can look off. So you either need to make accommodations in the pattern to alter it to fit over modern undergarments, or you need to purchase or make reproduction vintage undergarments. And as you kind of get further back in time, where we used support garments like corsetry, pairs of bodies, petticoats, that sort of thing, it does become more and more important to make sure that you are either creating or purchasing the garments that are going to give you the proper silhouette for the look that you want. Otherwise, you're not going to get the look that you want. So that's just something to kind of be cognizant and aware of as well. And the last thing that we are going to talk about, this is a little revisit from last week, is that when we're doing reproduction patterns, we want to make sure that we're using proper sewing techniques. So sewing techniques in the 1920s, 30s, 40s are going to be a little different than modern sewing techniques. So if we look back into the instructions, if we have that, or if we go back into these vintage sewing books that are going to give us information about these vintage sewing techniques, we're going to have a much more successful garment. So researching your vintage sewing techniques can really help these patterns go together nicely. All right, so we are going to go over how to actually read a pattern. And I'm going to use this Butterick pattern. This is a modern reproduction vest pattern as our example. So when we look on the back of a pattern envelope, first thing we're going to look at is we're going to look at our sizes. And that is, see if I can, oh, look at that, I'm so smart. So this is going to give us our chest measurement, our waist measurement, a hip measurement. And so we would take our actors or our personal measurements, and we would go across the chart and we would figure out what size we needed. So if I was fitting an actor who had a 46-inch chest, I would go over, see 46 inches, I need to cut out an extra large. Typically, we're going to work with whatever the largest measurement is. So if you're between pattern sizes, you would go with whatever the largest is. So if they had a 50-inch chest but a 46-inch waist, you would typically cut out the extra large here, the 56 or the 50-inch chest, and then you can modify the pattern down to the waist. That's going to be a lot easier than kind of shooting upwards there. So that's going to be the first thing that we're going to look at. The next thing we're going to look at is all this information on the back. This is going to tell us exactly what we need to purchase and what we need to have access to recreate this garment. So we can see on the front, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We have 6 different vest styles here. So if I wanted to make vest style A, if that's my favorite, I'm going to flip over. I know that I need to make an extra large because that is the size that my actor is. And then I can go down here, and if I scroll over with my finger, I see this column is extra large. And I can see vest A, either at 45 or 60 inch, all the way across the board, takes 1 yard of fabric. If I was doing vest B, you can see how that fabric allotment changes as we go across the sizes. So you want to make sure that you're matching up your size with your style so you purchase the right amount of fabric. And here we're using modern fabric widths, so we have either 45 inch or 60 inch. So we purchase the proper amount. This is also going to give us recommendations on what fabrics to use. So here it's recommending that we use a gabardine, a wool blend, suiting fabrics, something that's like a vest fabric. It's also going to give us information about lining, whether or not we need interfacing. And it's going to give us information about any notions that we might need as well. Typically on the back here, although I don't see it on this one, typically it's going to give you information about buttons, if you need zippers, if you need interfacing. That should be on the back here, but on this particular one, it is not. They're all a little different. So if we look at, again, the front of the pattern piece, it's going to show us line drawings of our styles. It's going to show us what the shapes are and what pattern numbers we have. And then it's going to give us very, very detailed instructions on how to put this together. So these are pretty easy to walk through. The one thing that we need to be really aware of as we're working our way through these patterns is the concept of ease. And so ease is kind of the extra space that a pattern company is putting into a garment to make sure that the garment fits the body properly. So some garments are meant to be very, very close fitting and form fitting. Some garments are meant to be a little looser depending on the style and depending on also on personal preference. And so when we look at our measurement information back here, this is going to tell us this is the body measurement. So this chest measurement, this would be for somebody who has a 50-inch chest. And this is what they would typically recommend for a 50-inch chest. If we go on the actual pattern piece, let me unfold it here. On most modern patterns, if you look on whatever the main pattern piece is, if you're looking at for a hip measurement, it's usually on either the skirt or the trousers. If you're looking for a chest measurement, it's going to be on the bodice or the vest. These numbers here are going to be the actual measurements of the garment. So you can see on the back of the pattern, our extra large is 46 to 48 inch chest. Here it says extra large 49 inch. So if we cut this pattern out and we follow the instructions exactly, this actual garment size should be 49 inches. And so they're recommending that this would fit a 46 to 48 inch chest. So they're saying that you should have anywhere from 3 inches to 1 inch of ease of extra fabric around the body. As you work with patterns, you're going to discover how much ease is appropriate for you or for your actors. And then also with these, not necessarily with a vest pattern, but with a lot of the reproduction period patterns as you get back into Victorian, older patterns than that, where there's supposed to be very, very minimal ease, the pattern companies are still using a standard grading system to create these patterns. So they're still going to build that 1 to 3 inches of ease into the garment. So a lot of times folks won't look at the actual garment measurements. They're just going to go off of the back here, and then they're going to be really upset when the garment is too big because it doesn't fit the way that it's supposed to fit. So working between the actual garment measurements and the measurements on the back of the pattern, you can figure out what's going to be the best size for you. Our pattern pieces are also going to give us a lot of information. Let me scan back out. There we go. There we go. it's going to give us a lot of information. Some of the more common markings that we have here, we have our darts that we'll need to mark. We have our buttonholes. It's going to show us exactly where our buttonholes are going to be. This particular vest is a lapped vest, so one piece kind of folds over the other. So this is telling us where our center front actually is. So this line should be going down the center front of the body, and there's going to be an overlap on either side. There's usually going to be an arrow, and this one I'm going to scroll up because it's a really, really long one. But let's see, arrow down here, it says grain line here. This is legit one of the most important pieces of information on our pattern pieces, because this is going to tell us exactly how the garment or how the pattern should be laid out on our fabric. And so when we're laying out our patterns on our fabric, we need to make sure that they are laid out correctly so that the garment sits on the body correctly. And we use what's called either the straight of grain or the bias of the fabric to help give either the garment strength or give it flexibility. And so this arrow, the arrow that's marked as grain line, is always going to go parallel to the edge of the fabric, that finished woven edge. It's called the selvage of the fabric. And so here we can see that line basically parallels the edge of the garment, which would parallel the edge of our fabric. So this is built to be very, very sturdy here, right at the front. Another example, y'all, I've made a mess of my stuff over here. Here we go. Another example of when you might need to use the bias. So if we look at this, cutting layout here, we've got, there we go. It's telling us exactly where the selvage is. It's telling us where that grain line goes in relation to the selvage. And you can see here, these two little rectangular pieces here, these little number 12s, it has our teeny tiny little grain line that goes parallel to the selvage, but then that's placing the pattern piece on the diagonal here on our fabric. That's what we want on these pattern pieces, because that's going to give these little rectangles stretch. They're cut on the bias, so it's going to give them stretch. And this particular pattern needs these rectangles to be stretchy for some reason. So when we're laying out our pattern pieces, looking at these cutting layouts can be really, really important. If we kind of laid our pattern pieces all willy-nilly all over the fabric, the garment may act in a way that we don't want it to act. So following these cutting layouts and following the grain of that fabric can be really, really important. All right, what else do we got here? And then as we work our way around the pattern, when we mark this out, and we're going to show you how to actually trace a pattern onto the fabric and transfer these markings. But we want to make sure that we transfer all of these little notches, all of these little marks, all of these weird little dots, because the instructions are going to tell us exactly what these mean. Typically things on the side like this is going to tell us where pattern pieces are going to join together. Again, our darts are going to pull that in. We've got pocket placement here. One line that people tend to ignore, which is actually a pretty important one, is the line that says lengthen or shorten here. So if we needed to make this particular vest longer because our actor was taller, or if we needed to make it shorter because our actor was shorter than our standard pattern size, we would actually cut along that lengthen or shorten here line and expand it out or pull it in so that it fit our actor appropriately. And the reason we want to do that on the line that they suggest is that they have, the pattern makers have determined that that's going to be the least disruptive of the pattern. It's not going to cause problems. It's not going to mess up the grading on it too much if we lengthened or shortened that there. And then we see this little circle that's separated into quadrants quite a bit. This is typically going to be at your center point of whatever garment piece you're making. So on something that goes over the chest, this is going to be the center point of the chest. If this was a pair of pants or a skirt, that would be at the high point of the hip, the widest part of the hip there. So that can be a useful tool in figuring out if we need to make this longer or shorter, where it needs to sit on the body. And then the last thing we need to be aware of is we've got 3 different lines here. So this is going to tell us which line we trace or which line we cut out to fit this particular vest on our actor. So we had previously determined that we needed to make an extra large. So we would trace or we would cut out along that dashed line there. So we need to make sure we're following these. We get to sections here under the arm side, where they overlap. And you just need to be really careful about going around the proper line. This is a pretty easy example, but some of them, they get really, and Adrian's nodding as well. They get really wonky. The lines can be very, very close together. So kind of a helpful trick, if you have a hard time following that line, you can go through with a highlighter or a colored pen and trace over that. So you make sure that you know exactly what line you're going to be cutting out before you trace it or you cut out your pattern. All right. And before we go over to the table, we're just going to go over a quick review of some fabric types. So the back of your pattern is going to tell us what our fabric recommendations are. And so as we're reading this, we can look at 2 different examples. We've got this vest pattern and we've got this 1930s vintage undergarments pattern. And they're giving us 2 very drastically different types of fabrics. We've got kind of woolens and gabardines and wool blends over here on the vest. And over here in the undergarments, we have cotton lawn, crepeback satin, crepe de chine, lightweight linen types, silky types. So very kind of flimsy sort of fabrics. So you want to make sure that you're purchasing the fabric that is going to best work for your pattern. And even if you don't get exactly what it says on the back, if you get something that has a similar weight or has a similar feel to it, you will generally get the same effect. So you want to make sure you're purchasing the right fabric. And we've got some examples here of, this is a cotton lawn. It is very, very fine, very kind of lightweight cotton. We have a very, very sheer embroidered chiffon. That can be appropriate for something. This is a wool twill. So this is kind of a medium weight sort of fabric. And you can see how this is going to act and it's going to look very, and you can see my fingers through it. That's really sheer. That's going to act and that's going to look very, very differently than this kind of nice, solid wool twill. Got some corduroy, some linen. So we've got some medium weight fabrics. And then we've got some heavier weight fabrics as well. And the other thing that we just need to be really, really careful about when we're cutting or laying out our fabric or laying out our pattern on our fabric is either pattern or the direction of the fabric. And it's a little hard to tell with this corduroy, but if you think about something like a, oh, it's shedding all over the place. If you think about something like a velvet where it feels good kind of going in one direction, and if you go back against the other direction, you feel like you're pulling against it. That's called the nap of a fabric. And so you want to make sure that your pattern is laid out so that when all the pieces are put together, the nap is all going in the same direction. Because if you cut out one bodice piece, so the nap is going down, and the other bodice piece, so the nap is going up, you're going to get a different sheen or a different shine on those 2 bodice pieces, and your garment is going to look odd. And it could be a design choice, but typically you want the naps to match. The other thing you want to be really careful about when you lay out your fabric is if you have this is probably a better example, if you have a geometric pattern that replicates itself, or if you have a large scale floral pattern that replicates itself, stripes, checks, any sort of pattern that's going to offer a lot of visual interest, you want to make sure that you line up your pattern pieces so that your pattern on the fabric matches up. Otherwise, you would have this really disjointed look if you had this line of rondelles going across here, and then you had another line going like here. That would look really disjointed. It would be really, really distracting. So when you're using patterns that when you're using fabrics that either have a nap or a very distinct pattern, you want to make sure that you are either purchasing extra, or sometimes the pattern will tell you how much extra you actually need to purchase for those fabrics. But you're going to need to give yourself some extra space to make sure that you are lining up your patterns appropriately. And we're going to go over how to trace out a pattern. Actually, if you want to hop over to this guy here. All right, so one of the things that we really recommend when you are working with a new pattern, or you're working with a pattern that, oh, hi, that's me. You're working with a pattern that you've never worked with before, we typically recommend that folks make up a mock-up or a toile. And that's going to be putting the pattern together out of a really cheap, kind of inexpensive fabric. We tend to use a lot of cotton muslin or inexpensive cotton broadcloth when that's on sale. And so you can see here, this was a period pattern. This is a vintage 1930s pattern that I had to size up for an actor. So I wanted to make sure that it worked before I cut it out of the expensive, irreplaceable fabric that the designer had purchased. So I put together this mock-up, and you can see all these little safety pins. I've got little sketch lines going around the arm side. I've got some sketch lines here. I had to take the skirt up. You can see that went up there. So I made all of these modifications on this mock-up, and this helped me fit this on the actor really, really nicely. And then I can go ahead and make these changes onto my actual paper pattern and then cut the garment out, and then it fit really, really nicely. So if the pattern is complicated, if the pattern is something you've never worked with before, if you're self-drafting like we looked at those books, always make a mock-up. You're gonna have a bad time if you don't. So we highly, highly recommend that you make a mock-up on these. All right, so if we go over to the table, so now we're going to go over how to trace out a pattern. And I'm going to introduce you to some tools that we use here in the costume shop that some you can purchase locally, some you can't, some you have to order online. The big one, the wax paper, you do have to order online, but it's such a useful tool, and it's something that it'll last you forever. Like, I pulled one of these pieces out because you can see this piece of wax paper has so many markings on it. Yeah, it looks like it is ratty as heck, but this piece of wax paper has been in the shop for at least 10 years, and it's still going strong. So it's an investment, but it's a really worthwhile investment. And so when we're tracing patterns in here, we're typically going to, and the reason why we trace patterns so that we can reuse them over and over again. We fit these patterns on lots and lots of different actors over many years. And if we cut out the original paper pattern, then we wouldn't be able to use it anymore. It would just fit that one size, that one actor. So when we have multi-sized patterns, we're typically going to trace, and that's going to allow us to preserve the pattern. And it's also going to give us the ability to make any modifications like we saw on that mock-up, on that toile, directly on the paper pattern without worrying about ruining it for future use. So we typically are going to trace our patterns in here. And so we will trace on, this is just a big old roll of craft paper. I've traced on the back of wrapping paper. I literally made a pattern last week on the back of a paper, like a grocery bag, a paper grocery bag. You can use newspaper, any sort of large piece of paper that you have access to. I've also traced patterns onto muslin if it's something that I'm going to be using over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. I will do that. It tends to be really, really sturdy. And then you can purchase pattern paper that has those 1-inch grid lines on it as well. And if you're transferring patterns out of those books, like we looked at the beginning of our time together, that could be a really, really useful tool for you. But typically, we like this, plain old boring craft paper. You can buy a giant roll of it for like $75 and it'll last you 10 years. So we've got that. We've got this wax paper. And so if you go to your local fabric store, your local craft store, you can purchase transfer paper. It's usually in the notions aisle. But the stuff that you can purchase there, and Adrian's shaking her head vigorously, it's awful. I mean, not to be disparaging about anybody's product, but it's a chalk base as opposed to a wax base. And the transfer lines just never come out really clean. They don't come out dark enough to really see. They rub off very, very easily. So we tend to use the wax paper when we transfer our patterns. And so this is a large sheet of paper. It has colored wax imprinted. Colored wax imprinted on it. It is going to rub off on your fingers. There we go. There we go. Yeah. So it is going to rub off on your fingers, but it washes right off with soap and water. This wax paper comes in a variety of colors. So if you're using this to transfer pattern markings onto your fabric, you can choose a color that's going to be close to your fabric while you can still see the markings. Sometimes it'll wash straight out of the fabric, sometimes it won't. So you want to make sure that you're doing a test as well to ensure that the pattern markings go away or don't go away as you see fit. But for transferring our patterns, we typically just use this dark blue. And so we have our craft paper here that we're going to be transferring our pattern onto. We have our wax paper, and we're going to make our little paper sandwich by flipping the wax paper over so that the wax is down on top of the craft paper. And you can see on the back of this sheet where we have overlapped pieces of wax paper when we're tracing out larger patterns. So it gets these little markings all over it, which just is delightful to me. So we've got our craft paper, we've got our wax paper, and now we're going to lay our pattern piece down. And this is my all-time favorite vest pattern. I use this. If you've seen a university theater production in the last 5 years and it's had a vest in it, it has been this vest pattern. I'll virtually guarantee it's a great vest pattern. And so we're going to lay that on top of our wax paper face up so we can see exactly what we're tracing around. And so here at UT, we're spoiled. I will fully admit we're spoiled. And these tables are pinnable. So we have these little, we have these very, very fancy push pins that we can pin directly through all 3 layers of paper here so that our pattern piece, our craft paper, and our wax paper does not shift as we're tracing our pattern. I don't have a pinnable table at home. Most people don't. So at home, you can use pattern weights. You can either purchase them, or you can, if I need to trace out a pattern at home, I will typically get soup cans out of my pantry and just drop some soup cans on top of everything to keep everything from shifting around.
Sarah McKinn is wondering what the name of that pattern is again.
This is the Buckaroo Bobbins vest pattern. Buckaroo Bobbins is a company that does a variety of kind of Western style wear. So I personally love it. And you can purchase them online, usually on Etsy, I think is where I got it.
Like those things.
Yeah. So we're gonna, basically you wanna make sure that your pattern piece, your wax paper, and your craft paper, or whatever you're tracing, you wanna make sure that they're not gonna shift around as you're tracing your pattern. Something you can use pins, you can pin things together, but you wanna make sure it's not gonna shift. And then we're gonna use, boop, boop, here we go. We're gonna use this little tool right here, and this you can get at your local craft store. Here we are. Yeah, you can get this at your local craft store, and this is a tracing wheel. Some of them have serrated edges like this one, some of them have smooth edges like this one. This is not gonna cut, it's just gonna put pressure onto our paper here. And we're just gonna take this little tool, and we are going to trace around our pattern. And so here, I'm just gonna pretend that I'm cutting out a size small. So I'm gonna choose a corner to start in, because when you've got these 3 layers, it can be hard to remember where you started. But I'm just going to trace around our pattern piece. Give it a little pressure. And you want to make sure that you are transferring all of the markings on your pattern piece onto your paper. So we're just going to go all the way around, following our instructions. So here we can see, all right, our small is here, and we're going to follow that line up here. So I need to follow this line here. Sometimes these independent pattern companies don't have dotted lines and dashed lines to help you differentiate. So you need to follow carefully. I don't know if you can hear that noise, it's terrible. We're gonna mark our dart here. That's a really important one. We're not gonna put pockets in this poor little bestie, so I'm not gonna mark the pocket. So if we were, we would need to mark the pocket. I'm gonna mark my green line here. That's gonna tell us exactly where this needs to sit on the fabric. And I'm going to mark this line here. That seems like an important one. And our buttonhole. So it's going to tell us where our buttonhole and our button placement are going to go. So this dotted line here, this says finished edge, and this solid line here says raw edge. So we know that this finished edge, that's going to be our stitch line. That's going to be our seam allowance. And so if we look at our instructions, it's going to tell us that it's going to tell us somewhere on here what our seam allowance is. I'm sorry, I should have highlighted this before.
That one's always been tricky.
I know, this one is super, super tricky. Goodness gracious, where is it on this one? We're just going to measure it because it tells us that. It gives us that information directly on the pattern. So we have our ruler here, 1/2 inch seam allowance. And so the seam allowance is really, really important because as we cut this out, we want to make sure that the seam allowance is the width that we want it to be. If we need to add in seam allowance, the pattern is going to tell us that. If we want to make it wider, if we want to make it more narrow, we can make those accommodations when we trace the pattern onto the fabric. But knowing what that seam allowance is going to help us size this appropriately. And some patterns, and seam allowance is going to vary on pattern to pattern. Most commercial American patterns have a 5/8 inch seam allowance. That's industry standard here in the US for commercial patterns. Independent pattern companies may have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. depending on what pattern company you are. A lot of international pattern companies tend towards a 1/2 inch seam allowance as well. And then there may be patterns that don't have any seam allowance at all, and you need to add your choice, your preference of seam allowance onto it. So reading the instructions prior to actually cutting out your garment, you're going to save yourself a lot of pain and a lot of anguish. I made the mistake last summer of cutting out a garment for myself personally, and had used that particular pattern company before, thought I remembered what the seam allowance was. It was not. It had no seam allowance in it, so the pattern ended up being too small for me, and I had a very bad time. So, we can see, I don't know if you can see that, but we have our pattern, there we go, is traced out on this piece of paper and has all the information that we need on it here. So I'm going to take my fabric scissors and
Non-fabric scissors.
oh, thank you, my paper scissors. My paper scissors and cut this out. I'm going to try to do this quickly so we can lay this out on the fabric and show you how to trace your pattern. All right.
With a question.
Yeah.
It's from Judy Morgan Day. She says, from whom do you order the transfer paper? I find only 12.5 inch wide rolls online.
We order it from Richard the Thread. The company is called Richard the Thread. Yeah, and if you need help finding that, Judy, follow up with me via email, and I will gladly send you a direct link because it's amazing. All right, so now we have our pattern piece. We have our fabric. And so since this is a vest, I'm using a nice woolen fabric here that is going to make a really, really lovely vest for our pretend actor. We will actually make this vest since I'm cutting it out, may as well. We want to make sure that our fabric is laid out nice and evenly. And you always want to pre-treat your fabric how you are actually going to treat the garment. So if this is something that you want to be able to machine wash, and the fabric supports machine washing. I personally wouldn't machine wash wool because it's going to shrink and you're going to have a bad time. But if you're doing something like a cotton, you can pre-wash that and it will shrink up the fabric so that when you wash it after you make the garment, it will not shrink then. So you want to treat the fabric like you want to be able to treat the garment. And anything that you cannot pre-wash, like this is our wool, typically silks, I'm not going to pre-wash because that's going to take the sheen off of them. Fancier fabrics, all of that stuff you're going to have to either hand wash or dry clean depending on the fabric content and what it tells you to do based on your own experience or what it says on the end of the bolt. But for things like your cottons and your linens, things that are a little sturdier, go ahead and pre-wash that. Pre-wash it on hot. Make sure it shrinks up as much as possible. That's also going to get a lot of the dye residue out of it, and your finished garment is going to be machine washable, which will be great. All right, so we've got our fabric lined up here. We have our selvage edge here on the edge of the fabric. So that's going to tell us where we need to lay out our pattern piece here. When we are tracing our pattern pieces, if we need to trace out two pattern pieces, you can either do it in 2 layers like this, or you can trace it out one at a time. The thing you need to be aware of, if you're choosing to trace it out one at a time, you need to make sure that you are doing mirror images of each other so that you get the right effect. If a fabric has a design printed on one side, it has a right side and a wrong side, whether that's printed or embroidered or woven or whatever, you always need to make sure that you're printing out or you're cutting out mirror images of that pattern piece. So you can either do that by making your fabric sandwich with the right side folded on top of each other like that, or by tracing it out and flipping it so that you have mirror images. Here, I'm just going to go ahead and place this so I can cut out 2 at once. I've got my grain line right here. I'm going to line that up with the edge of this woolen fabric. And then here I'm going to, again, use our push pins and pin directly through the fabric onto the table. If you do not have a table like this, you can use your standard pins, and you can pin carefully through the pattern piece and through the fabric. Or you can use pattern weights. You can use your soup cans, you can use your pin cushions, you can use whatever you have to kind of hold things down. But you want to make sure that your fabric and your pattern piece are not going to shift around. And from here, we're going to use our marking pencil. You could also use chalk, but use something that's going to work really well with your fabric. And I'm going to trace around this pattern piece as close to the edge as possible. And you want to get this really, really exact. The closer this is to the actual pattern piece, the better this is going to fit on you or your actor. So we're going to go all the way around here. Boop. I'm holding the fabric down as I make this mark so that I can press pretty heavily down on the fabric and it doesn't warp, it doesn't stretch. All right, so I've gone all the way around. The other thing that I need to do here is I need to mark my dart. I can do that 2 different ways. I can either slip my wax paper underneath the pattern like that. So my little sandwich is pattern, wax paper face down onto the fabric, and then the fabric itself. And I can trace directly onto the fabric using that wax paper. If you don't have the right color, if you don't have the right color wax paper, I can't really see that very well. Another little trick that you can do is you can take a pin. You want to create a little hole right there at the top of your dart. Stick your pencil through the hole and mark that point of the dart, like so. And then here we can see the bottom edges of that triangle. We're going to mark, and we're going to mark, and then we can lift up our pattern piece so we can see the top, that point of the dart, and we can just use our ruler and connect the dots like that. And that will accurately transfer that dart onto your fabric as well. All right. So now we have our pattern piece completely traced out. If we needed to add seam allowance to this, this would be when we wanted to do that. So we've got our pattern piece completely traced out. Say we wanted to add 1/2 inch seam allowance onto this. Let's pretend this doesn't have any seam allowance. That's going to be when we're going to take either our clear plastic ruler, I prefer those. You can also use a seam gauge. You can use a tape measure in a pinch, but it's kind of awkward. But you want to line up that 1/2 inch line with the edge that you just traced. And then you're going to trace around the pattern piece all over again to add in that extra seam allowance. And so what that does is that, A, gives us the extra seam allowance, which we needed, but it also gives us a stitching line. So if this is the line without seam allowance, and we're adding that extra seam allowance in, now we know that if we stitch right on that line when we run this through the sewing machine, that's going to give us a really, really accurate fit. So for things that are super, super fitted, like period garments especially, I like to trace the pattern piece itself, then add the seam allowance, and then go back and stitch directly on that traced line. And that's going to give me a really, really accurate fit. And so, goodness, we just have a few minutes left. There's never enough time with y'all. And then, so I'm going to trace around this super, super fast and just do a quick cutting technique, which sounds kind of insane. Like we're all adults, we know how to use scissors. I very famously failed using scissors in kindergarten. I failed how to use scissors, and I failed walking up the stairs. So I think those are on my permanent record somewhere. So don't tell anybody. They might not let me keep my job if they know I failed scissors. So we're going to cut around this line here. And so now we're going to use our fabric scissors as opposed to our paper scissors. And what we're going to do is we're going to keep the edge, that bottom edge of the blade, we're going to keep that so it runs straight and true on our cutting surface. So we don't want to let that bottom blade pick up or come off that cutting surface. And what that's going to do is that's going to give our scissors a lot of stability, and it's going to give us a really, really accurate cut. So if we picked up the fabric like this and just start cutting willy-nilly in this direction, we're going to get a really inaccurate cut. Our cut lines are going to be jagged, and we're not going to get the garment that we want. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take that bottom edge of our scissor, we're going to slip it under the fabric, and we're just going to control the fabric with our, whatever your non-dominant hand is. For me, it's my left hand. I'm going to cut with my right hand, and I'm going to let that bottom blade just rest on that table on my cutting surface, and I'm going to cut around this extra seam allowance that I added in there. And that's going to give us a lot of control over the scissors. And that may not make such huge difference for something like this wool that is pretty sturdy. But when you're cutting really, really wonky fabrics like a chiffon or really fine silk, something that really just doesn't want to behave, using this technique is going to get you the most accurate cut possible. So we're just going to cut down that front. This has to be as exciting as watching paint dry. And like that. So now we have finally got our pattern piece cut out. Our dart is marked, and we are ready to, if we had the rest of the pattern pieces, we would be ready to sew this garment together. Please join us for all of our future online endeavors. And I guess we'll see you next week.